Welcome to a Healthy Push podcast. I'm Shannon Jackson, former anxiety sufferer turned adventure mom and anxiety recovery coach. I struggled with anxiety, panic disorder, and agoraphobia for 15 years. And now I help people to push past the stuff that I used to struggle with. Each week, I'll be sharing real and honest conversations along with actionable and practical steps that you can take to help you push past your anxious thoughts, the symptoms, panic, and fears. Welcome. You're right where you're meant to be. I am so excited. I have Michelle here with me today, and Michelle is a holistic psychotherapist and a coach, and we're going to be talking about a subject that I haven't really talked about, but I know so many people are hugely affected by, and it's such an important topic, which is grief. So before we get there, Michelle, welcome to a Healthy Push podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So before we jump in, let's have people just meet Michelle. So who is Michelle? Tell us a little bit about you.
Michelle is, I've been practicing in the field for about 10 years now and have a deep love and passion for anything mind, body, spirit related. I'm definitely a believer in the integrative process of healing. So you'll hear me speak on Instagram about many of the connections between those three trios of our holistic wellness. And then I really love talking about grief and anxiety. How we intellectualize our thoughts moving into the body with any type of trauma that we face. And just been doing it for a while now and love it a lot.
Yeah, well, I knew when I came across your Instagram, I'm like, okay, I've been wanting to have this conversation about grief, and I just know and feel like you're the right person to do this with. So let's just start on a very simple level, but I feel like it's necessary because even myself, when I was like really thinking, what is grief? I feel like I can call out sort of what I feel when I felt grief, but I feel like it's a really hard thing sometimes to recognize, explain, really, really know what it is. So, in your terms, what is grief?
Yeah. Grief is so many things. It is I think, deep visceral experience that we move through. And it can be in conjunction with any loss, anything that we held dear to our hearts that's no longer present. Grief can be, the loss of a job, the loss of a partner, the loss of a loved one. It can be, most people relate grief to death, but it doesn't have to be grief to death. Grief can be in relation to a chronic illness, a diagnosis that you've received that has the potential to limit your physical and mental experiences. It really can relate to anything and everything. It can be the loss of your favorite shirt. You can grieve over that.
Yeah.
But I think grief is the experience that really allows our body to move through this kind of shaken up experience in our nervous system, and it provokes anxiety, it provokes sadness, it provokes anger, it provokes frustration, it provokes acceptance. It's a
Yeah.
multifaceted creature that we
Yeah.
all go through. Anyone that has emotions and feels goes through grief.
Oh, I love like everything that you just said. I think why, grief as an emotion, why it is so tricky is because it does bring on so many other emotions. And usually those emotions that are often really tricky. It's like super challenging to navigate. So I'm curious, what sort of, when you're experiencing grief, what sort of symptoms can come up? What can it look like when you're navigating that?
Hmm. When people say, I'm heartbroken,
Mm,
they literally are. When someone experiences grief and their heart hurts, it physically manifests as pain in the brain. It's the same as a physical acute pain. The pain is the exact same.
mm,
And the physical experiences and the emotional experiences and symptoms of grief are, increased anxiety, depression, sadness. It could be soreness of the body, headaches. It could be stomach aches, the strangest aches and pains. When it affects
mm.
our nervous system, it spreads. And so someone might feel chronic fatigue. Another person might feel like they're irritable all the time. Someone might sense that they're lightheaded or dizzy. Grief mimics the symptoms of complete nervous system dysregulation, whether it be fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. All of it is engulfed in grief. Um, and 20 million other symptoms besides those.
Right.
But that's to outline what one might consider. How does one feel with grief? What are the symptoms? Those are the ones to look out for.
Yeah, I think I've seen this, and I'm sure, of course, you have in your work. A lot of people can arrive to really struggling with an anxiety disorder because of grief and because of unprocessed grief and trauma. And I think that makes things so tricky because you're not always able to see that. You don't really have that awareness that, like, oh, it makes sense that I experienced a loss or a close loss or, the death of a relationship or whatever it is. And now I'm experiencing all this anxiety. Instead, you're just like, oh my gosh, why? This is so problematic. So I just wonder if you seen that with people.
Hmm. And it's a feedback loop, right? Sometimes people who are already predisposed to anxiety, their anxiety will increase inside of grief. And sometimes people who wouldn't ever identify as someone having anxiety, who then
Mm,
experience grief, have the anxiety. And the piece that's tricky for many individuals is it's so blended in together. So when someone has grief and anxiety, they're going to have ruminating thoughts. Their sense of regret is going to be more enhanced. They'll get stuck inside of, what if I could have done this differently? What if I could have had that last conversation?
mm,
What if I could have, um, I don't know, what if the relationship could have been different, especially to the people who they've lost? So, anxiety, I think, really intensifies the experience of grief, and vice versa. I think grief really intensifies the experience of anxiety. And when those
mhm,
two are intertwined, it's like a really big, scary monster for a lot of people because they feel like they'll never be able to move on. They'll feel like it's something that they can't let go of. And when all of this occurs, it's really, really confusing.
yeah, absolutely. There's just so much going on. So I want to go there, but I feel like before we go there, I want to go to a couple of other places. So with grief, I know you say grief has to really be released from your nervous system. I think that I agree. I think that's how a lot of the healing does happen surrounding grief, and especially when it's intertwined with anxiety. What do you mean by that? It has to be released from your nervous system.
Yeah, yeah. Our nervous system is this really beautiful thing that holds every one of our experiences. And because it holds every one of our experiences, it's like the blueprint to how we live our life. So when I say it needs to be released from the nervous system, what I mean by that is it needs to be processed. It needs to be held in a sacred space. It needs to be observed. It needs to be tended to, not just emotionally, but somatically. It needs to be moved through the mind and into the body. And when we're looking at our nervous system, the combination of the mental thoughts and physical experiences have to get to know one another. And I think a lot of us inside of grief and anxiety tend to stay so deeply in our brains in that intellectual place that we forget that we have a body. And so to
Mm.
move it, we need to feel it, not feel it just with our minds
Hmm.
or intellectualize it just with our words, but maybe we shake it off. Maybe we hold intentional touch to our bodies. Maybe we just like sit in meditation and feel what it's like to live inside of the experience of anxiety and grief. What color is it? What shape is it? What size is it? What texture? What heaviness? And when we give it the space to breathe and move it into our body, that's when it can be released. It doesn't mean that grief will just discontinue. It doesn't mean it will vanish. It will no longer be there. Grief is something that we have to adjust to and live with. But
Mm.
ultimately, when we move it through our nervous system, it helps that process of adjustment.
Yeah. And I imagine too at the same time, right? It helps to relieve some of the symptoms and the thoughts, the stuff that we want so badly to go away, and we're fighting it and trying to make it go away that way. But it's like, okay, well, maybe a way to help relieve all this is to actually feel it. I know that, of course, I've experienced grief myself. And I think one of the hardest things was when I was working through this was the encouragement that I was getting from my therapist to actually feel it. And I was like, no, 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 but I don't want, like,
I want to.
right, I don't want to. And it reminded me so much of when I was struggling with my anxiety disorders. And I was like, be with this, like, you want me to just be with this. And yeah, that experience, right, of wanting to run from it, wanting to get rid of it, like, of course you do. Like, no human is like, great, let me sit with this. But there was so much that I got from allowing myself to feel what the heck was going on in my body and how it was showing up in my body. i, I was just like, okay, yeah, I'm not a good feeler, but it takes that intentional practice, and so incredibly helpful. I imagine, of course, you've had that experience many times with people, you want to run from it. You don't want to feel it.
It's the primary complaint, I think, of most of my clients is, why do I have to feel this?
Hmm.
And what I always share is, well, first of all, our goal together is to make sure that you are safe. So at any point in time you decide it's too much for you, let me know, and we can back up a little bit and be wherever it is that you are. And the quote that we all know, the only way out is through.
Mm.
It's really true. I think to spiritually bypass grief would take away the that sense of adjustment and finding your way again. If we are to
Mm.
just ignore it, um, chances are you're not going to live life to your fullest. There's going to be stuff stored in the unconscious mind and the subconscious mind, the repressed feelings that will discolor some of your new life experiences. So I think to feel it is really important. And what I mean by to feel it too, I don't think it might be what everyone's thinking. It doesn't mean that we have to envision someone's death, or that we have to envision the loss of a job, or that we have to envision everything that we went through. It doesn't mean that we have to create the narrative over again as it was in the past. It just means there's this kind of abstract experience of feeling the essence of grief. Like maybe we feel into that frustration and that anger, and we just yell. Maybe we just
Hmm.
yell, or maybe we hit our chest as gentle slash whatever the word is, however we want to move with that, right?
Yeah.
As much as we possibly can to release whatever that is. So sitting through it and feeling it doesn't mean that we have to live through every single story of it. It just means we feel into the essence of it in our body, whatever that looks or feels like.
Oh my goodness. So much of what you just said. I'm like sitting here like thinking, dang, yep. I know people are thinking this or wondering this with grief. You sort of alluded to this. We obviously can't make it go away, but it's troublesome, right? When it keeps popping up, and it sort of feels like it comes in different versions. It sort of might subside, and then it comes back in these waves, and it can be incredibly challenging. So it's like, what how can we be better about making space for it? I guess it's like, we want it to go away. It's not ever going to really go away, but like, is there some optimism there?
Yeah. Grief doesn't have to be a monster. And a lot of people feel that grief is this, monster that has no end. And there is a truth to that. But I think ultimately, the language of self compassion inside of the grief experience, being able to hold like gentle, nurturing energy, being able to connect with people who have gone through it before. Like there are ways through it that aren't as terrifying. And I am a experiencer of grief. It's one of the reasons why I am so passionate about holding space for those who have grief, because I've been through my moments. And I think for me, you know, when my therapist and my chiropractor held space for me to process my sadness, There was nothing like it. Like, I think having the other person to witness your experience so you're not feeling as isolated or alone inside of your grief is very helpful. I don't necessarily think that everyone, it's not that you have to have a therapist or a coach or chiropractor to support you through that grief. However, I think it can be really helpful. There are groups, there are art classes, there are expression and movement resources, like anything that brings community to you
Mhm.
as you move through this, um, is going to be really helpful. So, and there are a million resources for grief, but it doesn't mean that every resource is right for you either, because it's not.
Yeah, I think you just hit on something big. I think grief can feel very isolating. It can be really challenging because, of course, even if somebody else has been through it, it's very unique to you and in your own experience. And of course, it's you who went through it. And so it feels very painful. And I think our tendency when you're experiencing loss or grief of any nature, right? It's like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to share. I don't. But I've found, personally and with so many others, that when you actually are able to be in community with others and to share and to know other people have gone through this too, and yeah, it hasn't looked exactly like my experience, but other people have felt what I'm feeling. Other people have had the thoughts that I've thought, that I'm truly not alone in this. I think
Mhm,
that is so incredibly helpful.
mhm. The feeling of belonging to a shared experience, especially in, Kristen F. works of self-compassion, is I mean, for me personally, and my therapy and in the therapy that I provide for others, it is the foundation from which I practice. Can we be kind to ourselves and to others? Can we bring whether you fully understand or not, the
Hmm.
idea of, my God, like, you are going through such a monumental thing. And a dear, dear friend in my life just lost, their best friend, their animal. And it's interesting because, when someone moves through even the loss of something that is a soulmate, is something that they can never replace. How do you move through that? How do you live again? And not only with her, but with other people, it's like the gentle moments of going outside and seeing a ladybug on a flower, or going outside and seeing that the sun will rise every single day and you get to begin again. Or that, wait a second, when you share on social media that you just lost your best friend, that there are 75 responses of, I can relate to that. This is what
Hmm.
happened to me. And when that shared connection occurs, there's something so healing about that. Doesn't mean, again, that the grief will vanish, but it means that, wait a second, I'm not alone. And I think for most people, whether they've lost a spouse, they've lost an animal, they've lost a child, wait a second, I'm not alone is the verbiage that brings them to that place of healing,
Hmm.
in addition to feeling it within their bodies, in addition to nurturing their nervous system. Like, grief is not just a
Right.
linear timeline of like, well, I just need to do that one thing
Yeah.
and everything will be fine. No, 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 no. It's this whole comprehensive spiritual experience of moving through all these different layers to get yourself to the place of, wait a second, today wasn't that bad. Today actually was okay. I can find joy again. I can smile again. My
Mhm.
anxiety is not as bad.
Yeah. I think something that I've heard a lot, and I'm not going to get this right, but I thought that this was such a beautiful way to frame it, that I've heard multiple people say that it's, it's not that you ever really get rid of the grief, right? It's that you sort of make space for it, like the container for it becomes bigger. And so it doesn't feel so consuming. But I think it translated for me so much with my anxiety disorder, struggling with panic and agoraphobia, that like the less I fought it and the less I tried to make it go away, and the more I just made space for it, it actually allowed me to experience that relief and to see I don't need to completely get rid of anxiety. Like, yes, I hate it sometimes and I really would love it to just go away and never come back. I don't need to make it not exist to continue to have this amazing, fulfilling, beautiful life. So I think that can be helpful too. Like, you're not going to get rid of it, right? But making more space for it is so helpful. I I'm curious what you're thinking, what you think about this, because this is something I hear a lot of people say, specifically relating to struggling with an anxiety disorder. I People will say, right, I feel like I am this different person. Like I am grieving my old life, my old self, like that person is gone. And I am now just this person who is deeply struggling with an anxiety disorder. And I don't ever see myself getting back to that version of me, that version that used to get in the car and go and do and go on the trips and not carry all this with me. Like, I think there is a very distinct type of grieving that happens when you're navigating an anxiety disorder and also other things, right? Also other struggles. But what are your thoughts on like, I feel like I'm grieving my old life, my old self, and that person's gone. Like
Mhm.
what now?
Mhm. It is one of the biggest identity shifts we will ever move through. And in most people's lives, it doesn't happen just once,
Mm,
it happens multiple times. And I think for those who, of course, have anxiety, and honestly, most people that experience grief will have anxiety too. It's hard to separate
mm,
those. There are some that might not have a lot of it, but a lot of people who have grief wind up having anxiety because they don't know what it's like to be in their new body. And it is a new body. I mean,
mm,
literally when we're inside of grief, our cells change because we are no longer that person anymore. I remember when I lost my father and I recognized that I'm not me anymore. I'm a different person. I am walking in this earth without a father.
mm,
And when someone moves through that experience, everything shifts. You're the person that you knew that you were is no longer that person anymore. And I think when we're looking at anxiety and we're looking at identity and we're looking at belief systems, we have to form a different sense of self. And that for anyone, whether you're coming out of honestly like a religious paradigm where you've been inside of a certain church system or a certain way of viewing the world and that ends, there's an identity shift. If we lose a parent or a spouse or a child, that's an identity shift. And what you said earlier, like what do you do if you have anxiety, if you can't move about your day? How do you support that if there's been this huge identity shift? And I would say that, and this is probably going to be a really hard thing to hear, but it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. When we're
mm.
inside of an identity shift, it just means that something has changed. As humans, we put an attached meaning to it. Something that's changed is bad. And of course, when we lose someone, it feels bad, but it's part of life. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It means that there is something that has internally shifted in our world and has externally moved. And now we have to find our footing again. But it doesn't mean that it's bad. And that's one of the things that I try and remind people of is we put meaning because it hurts. When something hurts, it means it's bad. But that's not necessarily a fact. It
Yeah.
feels like it's a fact, because
Yeah.
there's a feeling of it feeling bad. What is bad? How does bad look? Is it because it feels uncomfortable? And
Mm.
most of the time we identify bad with uncomfortable. And so if we can really work with that language when we're anxious of, wait a second, just because I feel this way, it doesn't mean it's forever. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that I am changing.
Oh, I think you hit on the identity shift, right? Is both good but incredibly hard because it is incredibly uncomfortable to look
Incredibly uncomfortable.
right. You see this sort of, it feels like this new person that's in front of you. And, I can look back now, not when I was in it. I don't honestly think I could have seen it when I was in it, right? But I can
Bit
look back,
harder.
yeah. But I can look back now and see, oh my gosh, that shift that I went through was so important, was so crucial that I developed this new awareness, this better sense of connection to myself, there is like so much new beauty and just newness. But of course, when you're in it, you're like, this newness, this shift, this change is bad and scary. And you put all these meanings to it and create this story about it. And before you know it, you're like, yes, everything is shit. My whole life is shit. And like, I am now this terrible person. And it's like, oh my gosh,
How am
wait.
I here?
Yeah. Yeah. But I know it's so scary because I think you hit the nail on the head. We go through these shifts and we really convince ourselves this is bad. And then I think our instinct, right, is to not be with it because it's like, but this isn't good and I need to fix this and I can't allow myself to be here. And it's like, but that's oftentimes what we need, right?
Very much so. And something to add to that, when it comes to the concept of anxiety, is those who are grieving. And if you tend to have more OCD tendencies, chances are that productivity is going to just increase to the sky. So there will be a lot of movement towards not tending to the feelings and the experiences in order to let go or in order to be present with grief, but moving out of it externally and hyper focusing, hyper fixating on work, on working out extensively, moving your body into a different position, controlling your food, controlling your diet, so that that hyper anxious state tends to rise. And I think that's something that when people are inside of the grief experience and they're already more prone to anxiety, they really have to be careful what starts to happen. Are they moving into hyperfixation? Are they um, displacing the feelings of grief onto their anxiety and hyper-focused attention to other things?
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. I'm so glad that you said that. Okay, now my brain is going to this place of with grief. Are there some things that I think you've hit on this, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Are there things that you would say like avoid this if you're going through grief? Like this will
Yeah.
not be helpful.
Yeah, yeah. I think especially inside of the therapy process or inside of the process of healing, if you move towards forcing yourself to go through grief, it's not helpful. We don't want to force any of that. If someone says it's going to feel a lot better to talk about it, kind of like we're
Yeah.
having a conversation about it, but we're not saying that, right?
Hmm.
So I would say if someone says it's going to feel a lot better to talk about it and you're not ready to talk about it, don't. There are ways around it so you can still feel into it. So do not force yourself to do anything. Um, Inside of the grief process, too, if you're not ready to look at people's pictures again, if you're not
Mm.
ready to toss away clothes, if you are not ready to release items, do not do it. Some people will say that, well, it's better if you just let that go and you move forward. No, no, take your time. Even if that means a year or two or three, what you can do inside of that, if you're having a hard time, if you're noticing you're having a hard time, is bring up the topic in whatever way that looks like. Maybe it's just to drop into a friend or drop into a therapist that says, hey, I realize that I kind of want to let some of this stuff go, but I can't. Can you help me with that? Can we be in
Mm.
conversation with that? So do not force, do not let go or throw away if it's not the right time to. Just really be with yourself. Because I sometimes think people want to make it like they want to quicken the experience, they want
Yeah.
to speed it up. And, some people look at me when they come to me for grief, whether it's the loss of a spouse or again, anything. And I look at them and they say, how long is this going to take?
Yep.
And I say, I honestly don't know. It's your own timeline, and we'll figure it out together.
That's not the right answer, Michelle.
No, why are you telling me that? I don't wanna
Right.
hear that.
Give me a 2 months, 3 months, and I'm going to be over this. I know. As you were talking, I was thinking, growing up, I had this aunt, and she lost a child at a really young age, and she like kept his bedroom intact for the
Yes.
longest time. And I remember even as a kid, people would have their opinions and would say, she just needs to get rid of that stuff. And as a kid, I thought, how can you say that? How can you feel that way? That this is how she's processing the grief and it is healthy for her.
Absolutely.
And I think that's important too, to like you said this, right? That it's going to look differently for everyone and you have to really honor what feels good and right for you and not trying to force that, because that forcing, she very well could have gone up into his room and gotten rid of all of his stuff, and would that have made the grief go away? No.
No, no, the repressing of grief is one of the worst things that we can do. And you brought up something beautiful just then that reminded me of something else, which is the spiritual experience that we have with
Mhm.
grief. Like, who's to say that she didn't go up to that room and talk to his soul and
Yeah.
create a memorable relationship with him in a different form? And I'm all about, and if this doesn't resonate with you, leave it. You don't have to take what I'm about to say, but talking to the souls of those who have transitioned, maintaining a relationship with them, talking to them about how your day has been and sharing with them a really um, important thought that no one else knows. It's almost like talking to a higher self, talking to God, talking to source energy, whatever anyone would want to call it. And if you're agnostic, of course that wouldn't relate to you in this moment, but you can keep a journal. You can still
Mhm.
talk to the essence of someone who's transitioned. And so, yes, to your friend who had that experience, it's like, well, what if that's kind of the living energy of the person who has transitioned and they want to keep it? And, I think some grief specialists might tell you that that's not a healthy thing, and everyone's entitled to their own opinion here. But I will say, from my perspective, that whatever brings that feeling and sense of well being to your body is helpful. Now, of course, if someone is to do that and that's all their life is,
Yeah.
that would be an unhealthy fixation, but that's not what we're referring to. We're talking about just honoring their spirit and keeping them alive in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you brought up the spirituality component, and I think it is not for everyone, but I think if it is, or if you've had
Mhm.
thoughts, if you've wanted to go there, that is something that also is so incredibly helpful for me. With my grandfather, he was sort of the first person that I lost, and it was so hard. And my mom taught me, right? Like, he's not gone. You can still talk to him and you can still have this relationship. And I at first thought, Mom, you're a bit crazy. This is this is a bit woo-woo. But she has always connected to him in that way. And she would tell me these beautiful stories. And I'm like, okay, maybe it's not so woo-woo. Maybe I can give it a shot. And it was incredibly helpful for me. And I think, it's just tapping in to what is helpful for you and allowing yourself to go to some places that might not feel so comfortable, but might
Right.
be really helpful.
Yeah.
So, oh my gosh, this is such a big and can be heavy topic, but I feel like you've brought a lot of lightness to it. I feel like just I don't people tell me this all the time and I'm like, "What? I love your voice. You are so calming." Like, you're just so helpful and I love everything that you share. So, if people want to connect with you, Michelle, and learn from you, where can people find you?
Yeah. So I'm on Instagram at therapy.with.shelly. Um, on TikTok as well, same name. I have a website if you're curious to know more about me and the practice that I do. I do meditations on Insight Timer, so that's
Mm,
fun. I enjoy that.
cool.
And to share one more message with
Yeah.
our listeners today, I would say that if you're going through grief, to remind yourself that you hurt so much because you love, that grief is love. That's all it is. And if we can remind ourselves that, we can find joy again. We really can.
All right, no better way to end this. Thank you again, Michelle. I really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Healthy Push. If you want more, head on over to ahealthypush.com for the show notes and lots more tips, tools, and inspiration that will support your recovery. And if you're hoping for me to cover a certain topic, be sure to join my Instagram community at A Healthy Push and let me know in the comments what you want to hear next.